The sleepover. It was supposed to be a simple, fun sleepover. Jane, Alice, and Clara, three best friends since childhood, planned to spend the weekend together at Alice's family cabin, a cozy but remote place deep in the woods. It was old, but the warmth of the wood and familiar scent of pine made it feel safe. They had all stayed there before, but never alone. The night started with laughter, ghost stories, and too many marshmallows. But as midnight drew closer, an eerie silence fell. The girls huddled together around the fireplace, listening to the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. They joked about the tales they'd heard of the cabin being haunted, brushing off any fear with laughter. However, strange things began to happen. The first sign was a soft tapping on the window. Jane, the skeptic of the group, rolled her eyes and claimed it was just a branch swaying in the wind. But the tapping persisted, growing louder, and then it stopped abruptly. Minutes later, Clara noticed something strange in the reflection of the window. A shadow standing near the edge of the forest, too still to be human. But when she turned to show the others, there was nothing there. As they settled back into the night, they heard a faint scratching coming from upstairs, a place they hadn't planned on going. Curiosity soon got the best of Alice, who suggested they check it out together. They climbed the creaking stairs, their breaths held tight as they ventured toward the source of the sound. The attic was dusty, filled with old furniture and forgotten memories. But there was something off, a heavy, cold presence that weighed on them. As they moved toward the far end of the room, they noticed an old dollhouse, one none of them remembered seeing before. Jane opened the dollhouse out of curiosity. Inside, they saw tiny dolls posed exactly as the three of them. One seated, one standing, and the third frozen in terror. The dolls' eyes seemed to follow their every move, watching, almost as if they were alive. As Alice reached to close the dollhouse, they heard the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs, loud, echoing, and growing closer. They looked at each other, panicked, unable to decide if they should hide or confront whatever was approaching. The footsteps stopped just outside the attic door. They heard a slow, deliberate knock. None of them dared to answer, but the door creaked open on its own, revealing a figure shrouded in darkness. The silhouette was just an outline, but the chilling sense of being watched overwhelmed them. Clara whispered, "We have to leave now." In a desperate bid to escape, they rushed past the figure, tearing down the stairs, only to realize something horrifying. The furniture in the living room was now arranged exactly like the dollhouse. The shadowy figure appeared at the top of the stairs, whispering their names one by one. With a scream, the girls bolted outside, running through the forest until they reached the nearest road, never daring to look back. They made it home safely, but were forever haunted by that night, with visions of the dollhouse that seemed to know their every move. Every now and then, Jane claims to hear the tapping sound in her own home, a sinister reminder that whatever was in the cabin that night still watches them. Weeks passed since that terrifying night at the cabin, but the memory lingered, growing darker with each passing day. Jane, Alice, and Clara barely spoke of it, each one haunted by their own version of the ordeal. Jane had started seeing shadows move in her house. Alice couldn't sleep without a light on, and Clara had taken to watching her own reflection in windows, expecting to see something or someone watching her from behind. They each tried to move on, to convince themselves it had been their imaginations. But then Alice received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph of the three of them, taken from the attic window of the cabin. In the background was the faint outline of the shadowed figure they had seen on the stairs. Panic-stricken, she rushed to call Jane and Clara, urging them to come to her house. When they arrived, they pored over the photograph, every line and shadow sending chills down their spines. How was it possible? None of them had a camera that night, and they had left the cabin hours before sunrise. Who, or what, had captured this image? Clara tried to burn the photo, but it wouldn't catch fire. Even when she lit a match and held it to the edge, the paper remained untouched, as if protected by some dark force. They had no choice but to leave it alone, though unease filled the room, a sense of dread lingering in the air. Over the following days, they noticed strange things happening around them. Each girl began finding tiny, lifelike dolls outside their homes, dolls that looked eerily similar to themselves. Jane found hers propped on her bedroom windowsill, arms positioned as if scratching to get in. Alice discovered hers on the front porch, eyes gazing straight up at her. Clara's was on her pillow, its tiny mouth sewn shut. One night, Jane awoke to the sound of whispering in her room. She could make out faint voices, just above a murmur, calling her name. Trembling, she switched on the light, but there was no one there. Yet when she looked at the mirror on her wall, she saw the reflection of the attic room in the cabin, with the same dolls from that night staring back at her. Frantic, she broke the mirror, but the whispering continued, growing louder, echoing around the room. The next day, they gathered again, desperate to figure out what was happening. They decided to go back to the cabin, to face whatever force had followed them home, and end it once and for all. The journey there was filled with tense silence, each girl dreading what they would find, but knowing they had no other choice. When they reached the cabin, it seemed different. Darker, colder. The air itself felt thick and heavy, as if warning them to stay away. But they pushed forward, forcing open the front door, which creaked in resistance. Inside, the furniture was arranged exactly as it had been in the dollhouse, as if no time had passed since their escape. They went straight to the attic, heartbeats racing as they climbed the stairs. The dollhouse was still there, but it looked even more sinister. Its dolls were arranged in different positions, now facing each other with twisted expressions, almost as if they had been waiting. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut behind them. They tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The room grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder than ever, circling around them. In horror, they realized the dolls in the dollhouse were moving, their tiny limbs jerking into new poses that mimicked the girls' own actions. Then, the shadowed figure emerged, standing by the dollhouse. Its face was obscured, a dark void where its eyes should have been. The whispers grew louder, echoing their names in a haunting chant. With no way out, Jane reached into her pocket, pulling out the picture they had tried to burn. She held it up to the figure, demanding, "What do you want from us?" The figure extended a long, shadowed hand, pointing toward the dollhouse. Jane, terrified but determined, took one of the dolls in her hand, feeling a strange, icy sensation seeping through her fingers. The doll felt alive, almost pulsing in her grip. Then a voice echoed in the room, a deep, hollow sound, like the wind through a forgotten crypt. "Return what you took," it whispered. "But we didn't take anything," Alice cried, her voice trembling. The figure's shadowed face seemed to shift, its mouth opening slightly, as if to reveal something. But before it could answer, a piercing scream filled the room, a scream that sounded just like Clara's. Clara collapsed, clutching her chest, her eyes wide in terror as she looked at the doll in her hand. It was identical to her, even down to the small scar on her wrist. As her grip tightened, the doll's face contorted, mirroring her own fear. The voice spoke again. "Release us, and your souls shall remain yours. Refuse, and you shall join us." Desperate, Jane held up the doll she had taken, tossing it toward the shadowed figure. The doll vanished, dissolving into the darkness. One by one, Alice and Clara did the same, until all 3 dolls were gone. The figure nodded slowly, as if satisfied, and the whispers ceased. The cold lifted, and the attic door unlocked, creaking open slowly. They stumbled out, exhausted but alive, leaving the cabin without a second glance. As they left, they realized something horrifying. The photograph was gone, and in its place was a new doll. It looked just like the 3 of them, bound together with a single, unbreakable thread. Jane, Alice, and Clara left the cabin behind, relieved to have escaped but unable to shake the feeling that something had followed them. The strange doll, left in place of the photograph, haunted them. They couldn't understand its meaning, the way it seemed to bind their fates together with that single thread. But they were too exhausted to do anything more that night. The next morning, each of them woke up with something strange in their hands. Pieces of what seemed to be a broken mirror, each with a reflection of the doll from the cabin. Their panic grew, and they immediately gathered at Jane's house, locking themselves in her room to figure out what the mirror pieces meant. But when they tried to lay the pieces together, they discovered an unsettling truth. The fragments didn't make a full mirror. It was as if parts of it were missing, and without all the pieces, they could not know what the mirror would reveal. As they debated their next move, they noticed something more disturbing. The mirror fragments had begun to darken, each one displaying shifting shadows and strange images of places they recognized. Clara's room, Alice's backyard, and Jane's hallway. It was as though the mirror was showing them their own homes, but each scene held the shadowed figure, standing still and waiting. "This isn't over," Clara whispered, her voice shaky. "We thought we left it behind, but it's here. It's still with us." Desperate, Alice suggested they revisit the cabin to search for the remaining pieces of the mirror. Jane and Clara hesitated, but they knew they had no other choice. They left that afternoon, retracing their steps through the forest until they reached the cabin again, now feeling darker and more ominous than before. Inside, everything was as they'd left it, except for one change. The dollhouse was gone. In its place lay a single mirror shard, larger than the fragments they had at home. The girls knew this was one of the missing pieces. As Jane picked it up, a chill shot through her fingers, and for a moment, she felt like she was back in the attic, hearing the whispers that haunted her dreams. They took the piece back to Jane's house, where they carefully laid it with the other fragments. The mirror now showed a nearly complete image, revealing the dollhouse with the 3 bound dolls. But there was something else. A faint, scrawled message along the edge that seemed to appear only when all the pieces were close together. The message read, "Find us where we were buried." The words filled them with dread. Were they dealing with spirits bound to the cabin? Or was this something even darker? Clara remembered an old rumor, one she'd heard years ago, about 2 sisters who had vanished in the area decades ago. The girls were never found, but locals believed their bodies were hidden in the woods around the cabin. No one ever found out the truth, and the story became just another ghostly tale told around campfires. Hoping to free themselves from this dark force, they set off into the woods, searching the forest near the cabin with flashlights in hand. Hours passed, and they were about to give up when Clara's flashlight caught the glint of something buried under a mound of stones, hidden by fallen branches and overgrown vines. With trembling hands, They cleared away the debris, uncovering 2 small graves marked by crumbling wooden planks. As they dug deeper, they unearthed 2 dolls, each one crafted with shocking detail. The dolls looked just like the 2 sisters Clara had mentioned, dressed in old-fashioned clothes with hollow, empty eyes. Suddenly they heard a soft, whispering wind brushing through the trees around them. The shadows began to twist, forming familiar shapes. The sisters, standing silently before them, their ghostly forms watching with sad, hollow eyes. Jane, her voice shaking, spoke to the spirits. "We're sorry, we didn't mean to disturb you. What do you want us to do?" One of the apparitions raised a ghostly hand, pointing toward the mirror fragments Jane carried. The girls realized what they had to do. The spirits wanted them to reunite the pieces and place them over the dolls. With a heavy heart, they laid the mirror shards over the dolls, forming the full mirror at last. As they did, a soft glow emitted from the glass, and the shadows around them began to fade. The mirror showed the dolls bound no longer, but standing together. Peaceful. Just as they thought it was over, the ground beneath the dolls shuddered, and the mirror shattered into a cloud of dust. The spirits gave the girls one last look, a nod of gratitude, before fading into the misty forest. Relieved, the girls turned to leave. But as they walked back, Jane noticed a mark on her wrist, a small faint symbol that hadn't been there before. She glanced at Alice and Clara and saw they too bore the same mark. They'd freed the sisters' spirits, but it came at a cost. Somehow they now bore a mark from the dark force that haunted that forest. And even though the cabin and dolls were left behind, they couldn't help but feel that this was not the end, that something, some dark force, had now marked them, bound to them in a way that no one could understand. Days turned into weeks, and Jane, Alice, and Clara tried to return to their normal lives. But despite their efforts, a lingering darkness followed them. The faint mark on each of their wrists was a constant reminder of that night in the woods, a symbol they couldn't erase, no matter how hard they tried to scrub it away. One evening, Jane was at home alone when she noticed a strange reflection in her bedroom mirror. At first, she thought it was her imagination, a trick of the light. But as she looked closer, her stomach twisted with dread. There, in the corner of the mirror, she saw the cabin. It was faint, almost a shadow, but unmistakable, and within it stood the dollhouse, perfectly intact. Jane stepped back, her heart racing. How was it possible? They had left the dollhouse in the woods, and yet here it was, appearing in her own mirror like a ghostly reminder. When she called Alice and Clara, they admitted they'd seen similar visions. Alice had seen the shadowed figure from the attic, flickering in the glass of her bathroom mirror. Clara claimed she had heard whispers coming from her closet mirror, faint but chillingly familiar. That night, they decided to meet at Jane's house to investigate what was happening. Sitting together in her dimly lit room, they stared into the mirror, waiting for any sign of the apparition. As midnight approached, a strange fog began to form within the mirror's glass, swirling and shifting until a dark shape materialized. It was the shadowed figure, the same one that had haunted them in the cabin. Its hollow, empty face seemed to watch them, even though they saw no eyes. It raised a hand, slowly pointing down to the floor. The girls exchanged nervous glances, understanding the message. They were meant to look beneath the mirror. They carefully removed the mirror from the wall, revealing a hidden compartment that none of them had known about. Inside lay an old, crumbling book bound in worn leather, its cover marked with the same symbol etched on their wrists. The book had no title, only the faded ghostly images of the two sisters they had freed in the forest. Opening the book, they found page after page filled with handwritten notes, diagrams, and strange symbols. It was like a journal, filled with tales of rituals, dark magic, and entries about souls that could be bound to objects. One entry in particular caught their attention. It detailed a ritual that could transfer the soul of a person into a doll, binding them forever. The entry ended with a warning. Once marked, the bond can never be broken. The realization hit them hard. By placing the mirror shards over the dolls in the woods, they hadn't just freed the spirits of the sisters. They had connected themselves to a curse that had bound the sisters for decades. The mark on their wrists wasn't a token of gratitude. It was a binding, a dark pact made in exchange for releasing the spirits. As they pored over the book, they noticed a final entry that seemed written in a different hand, more recent, with shaky, hurried letters. It read, "If you're reading this, it's too late. The mark is a chain that cannot be broken. The only escape is to pass it on. Find another, and the spirits may release you. But beware, every curse comes with a cost." The girls were horrified. They didn't want to pass this curse to someone else, but they knew that as long as they bore the mark, they would be bound to the darkness of the forest, haunted by the cabin and the shadowed figure that still watched them. In the days that followed, the hauntings grew worse. Mirrors in their homes reflected visions of the cabin at all hours. Jane swore she felt cold, skeletal hands on her shoulders whenever she looked into a mirror for too long. Alice reported hearing faint sobs coming from her mirrors at night. Clara's dreams were plagued by visions of the dollhouse, each one more vivid than the last. Desperate, they revisited the forest one last time, hoping to destroy the curse at its source. Armed with the book, they retraced their steps to the graves of the sisters, intending to bury the book and their marks with it. But when they arrived, they found something chilling. The graves had been disturbed, as if someone had dug them up. Only the shattered remains of the dolls were left, strewn across the ground, with pieces missing. A chill settled over them as they realized what it meant. The sisters hadn't been freed. Instead, they had latched on to the girls, using them as vessels, forever bound by the curse. And now, it was spreading. In one last attempt, Jane placed the book on the ground, lighting it on fire. As the flames consumed the pages, the air around them grew still, almost eerily silent. For a brief moment, they felt relief. Maybe this would be the end. But as the book burned to ashes, the mark on their wrists began to sear, leaving them in unbearable pain. The shadowed figure emerged once more, its hollow face now twisted into a sinister grin, as if mocking them. And then they understood. The curse wasn't meant to be broken. By burning the book, they had removed any chance of escape. They would remain bound to the sisters, cursed to live with the mark forever, haunted by the shadowed figure that would follow them wherever they went. Their only hope lay in a dark choice: to find someone else to pass the curse on to, or to accept their fate and live forever in its shadow. As they left the forest, the weight of their decision hung heavy. Every mirror they passed showed faint, shadowed figures watching, waiting. And as they looked at each other, they knew that no matter what they chose, they would never truly be free.